But you've never gone there, have you, to work? You don't really like the live stuff, do you, or do you?
I don't do live stuff, or very seldom. No, I prefer television. That's my sort of...
Benny Hill was once the king of British comedy, pulling in over 20 million viewers per episode and making the world laugh with his slapstick charm and cheeky sketches. But in a shocking twist, one particular scene became the final nail in the coffin of the Benny Hill Show. What was it about this sketch that crossed the line? Why did ITV, after decades of loyalty, suddenly cut ties with their biggest star? The answer is more than just a controversial joke. It's a glimpse into a cultural shift that Benny never saw coming. Let's dive in. A comedy powerhouse. Before he became one of the most controversial figures in television comedy, Benny Hill was nothing short of a phenomenon. Born Alfred Hawthorne Hill in Southampton in 1924, he came from humble roots. Early in life, he worked as a milkman, a driver, even a drummer, never quite settling into a path until he found his calling in making people laugh. What started as stand-up routines in clubs and theaters quickly led to his true stage, television. The Benny Hill Show premiered in 1955 and initially had a modest following. But as the decades rolled on, the format evolved, blending vaudeville, slapstick, and British music hall comedy into something entirely unique. His sketches became famous for their cheeky humor, fast-paced chases, and of course, the iconic Yakety theme song. His physical comedy, combined with innuendo-laced punchlines, won over millions. At its height in the late 70s and early 80s, The Benny Hill Show reached audiences in over 140 countries and attracted more than 21 million viewers in the UK alone. What made Benny Hill so remarkable wasn't just his comedic timing, it was the fact that he wore so many hats behind the scenes. He wrote most of his own material, directed sketches, and even played multiple roles in a single episode. He was the very definition of a one-man comedy machine. His show didn't rely on glitzy production. It thrived on simplicity, timing, and Hill's unwavering commitment to a comedic style that was rooted in slapstick tradition. Yet, not everyone was laughing. As the world moved forward, Hill's comedy stayed exactly the same. To longtime fans, it was classic British humor. To critics, it was outdated and tone-deaf to the cultural changes of the time. Feminist groups began calling out the portrayals of women. Media watchdogs raised eyebrows. Still, Benny refused to adapt. He believed comedy should be lighthearted and unfiltered. "People know it's just a joke," he once said. "It's meant to be fun." But television is a reflection of its audience, and the audience was beginning to change. What once passed as innocent innuendo was now being re-examined under a harsher light. Executives who once stood by him began to question whether the show still belonged on air. Still, no one expected that it would be one single scene, one sketch, that would finally tip the balance. The scene that crossed the line. For decades, Benny Hill thrived by walking the thin line between cheeky humor and outright controversy. But in 1989, that balance finally collapsed. It wasn't just a gradual decline, it was one particular sketch that would come to symbolize the end of the Benny Hill Show. The sketch aired as part of a routine episode during the final season. On the surface, it seemed like classic Hillfare, a parody set in a doctor's office where Benny played a bumbling physician and several young, scantily clad female patients arrived for examinations. What pushed it over the edge wasn't just the costumes or the slapstick, it was the context. At a time when the world was becoming more sensitive to the way women were portrayed in media, this particular sketch came across not just as tasteless, but outdated and overtly objectifying. For years, Hill had managed to brush off criticism as harmless fun. But this time, the backlash was swift and sharp. Feminist groups condemned the sketch as demeaning, while critics accused it of promoting under the guise of humor. Letters poured into television networks, and public debates erupted about the responsibilities of entertainers in a changing world. What had once been forgiven as a product of its time was now seen as part of the problem. To make matters worse, the sketch aired shortly after several other British comedy programs had begun evolving their content, opting for more progressive, socially aware humor. Shows like Blackadder and Only Fools and Horses were proving that audiences could laugh without the same old jokes about women, weight, or The industry was shifting, and Benny Hill was clearly being left behind. ITV, the network that had long supported Hill's work, could no longer ignore the growing discomfort. Executives, already considering cost-cutting and restructuring, found in the backlash the perfect excuse to finally pull the plug. Despite decades of success and millions still tuning in, The Benny Hill Show was abruptly canceled in 1989, with that particular sketch often cited as the final straw. For Benny Hill, the cancellation was devastating. He hadn't seen it coming. He thought audiences still loved him, still needed the kind of humor he had spent a lifetime perfecting. But times had changed, and no amount of past glory could shield him from the evolving standards of the entertainment world. The aftermath and legacy. When The Benny Hill Show was canceled in 1989, it didn't just mark the end of a television era, it signaled a personal downfall for the man behind the laughter. Benny Hill, once the most recognizable face of British comedy, found himself out of step with the times and out of work. He never created another successful television show. Offers dried up. The man who once commanded tens of millions of viewers each week was suddenly sitting alone in a modest flat, watching reruns of his own program. The very thing the world had turned away from. Yet Benny never voiced bitterness. He rarely gave interviews and never lashed out at critics. In private, friends say he was heartbroken but resigned. "I made people laugh," he once quietly remarked. "That's more than some ever get to do." But behind the humor was a man deeply impacted by loneliness. He had never married, and though he had several close relationships over the years, none developed into lifelong partnerships. Fame had brought him global adoration, but not the kind of personal connection that could fill the void. In 1992, just 3 years after his show was canceled, Benny Hill passed away alone in his apartment from heart failure. He was 68. Days passed before his body was discovered. The press called it a tragic ending, but many of his loyal fans saw it as a somber farewell to a misunderstood genius. His funeral was small, yet attended by friends, fellow comedians, and admirers who remembered not just the jokes, but the joy he brought. Over time, public opinion began to soften. While many still acknowledge the outdated elements of his sketches, there's also a growing recognition of his comedic brilliance, his ability to deliver laughs without uttering a single word, his knack for timing, and his extraordinary versatility. Younger generations discovering The Benny Hill Show online often marvel at its raw, unfiltered energy and physical comedy. International audiences in particular continue to enjoy his work, separated from the cultural criticisms of the past. Today, Benny Hill's name is mentioned alongside comedy legends, not because his style aged perfectly, but because he carved out a space in the industry that no one else could replicate. He was fearless in his silliness, bold in his simplicity, and tireless in his craft. Comedy changed, but Benny remained true to what he believed comedy should be: fun, fast, and unpretentious. His story is one of both triumph and tragedy, a reminder of how quickly the world can shift and how even the brightest stars can fade in silence. But make no mistake, Benny Hill made the world laugh, and for that, his legacy endures. The scene that ended The Benny Hill Show wasn't just about one sketch. It was about a world that was changing. And while Benny Hill's humor may no longer suit modern sensibilities, his impact on comedy is undeniable. If this story gave you a new perspective, like and subscribe for more untold moments from entertainment history.